We are live now, I think.
Yes, I think so. Should we wait a little more for Mary Noonan to connect?
I just wanted to tell you that we have taken this opportunity to circulate among the members of Alliance Française, as it is a French translation which is being promoted today. So we are expecting a good number of listeners from Alliance Française platform.
Oh, that's very nice.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Cécile, vous avez fait la traduction, vous aussi.
Oui, je ne suis pas traductrice, mais il m'arrive de traduire, comme je l'ai fait pour Debasish, de façon ponctuelle, alors que vous vous avez traduit énormément d'après ce que j'ai lu.
Pas vraiment, quand je veux. C'est un peu comme vous. Quand je veux vraiment faire la traduction, je le fais.
Oui, vous faites énormément de choses.
Vous traduisez des poètes vers quelle langue? Vers le
français ou bien de l'anglais?
Oui.
En bangla.
Au bangla, d'accord.
Oui.
Hello.
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 Hello. I'm very
Hi, Mary.
Hiya. I'm so sorry I'm a little bit late.
Hello.
I had a moment of panic because I had the wrong browser for the link. So I had a moment of panic because I had to start downloading a new browser. And I'm not the most technical person in the world. So anyway, thank God I managed it. So
Thank God indeed.
so I'm very happy to meet you all.
So am I.
Delighted,
Very
Mary.
happy to meet you too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely to meet you.
So shall we start now, Debasish?
Yes, of course. Absolutely.
Well, tonight we are gathered for this is a very great occasion, the international launch of Paysages sans Verbes, Debasish Lahiri's new book, published by Apic Éditions in Algeria just a few weeks ago. Several countries are virtually present here in our panel. Our daily lives may be still disrupted worldwide, but this will never stop us from celebrating the power of the poetic word. Distances are nothing when it comes to poetry, as words inevitably go on their paths. I'm quite convinced that poetry is a form of resilience, a way of staying together, a way of stretching out our virtual hands to remain together and resist. I would like to pay a warm tribute to Madame Kanchana Mukhopadhyay, longtime president of the Alliance Française du Bengal, for her presence with us tonight. It is a great privilege for me to introduce her. Mrs. Kanchana Mukhopadhyay is the founder member of Intact Conservation Center in Kolkata and co-convener of Intact, the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage. She is a scholar of French and Indian history and the author of Chandanagore and its Dependencies, 1674-1731, a reference book of French history in Bengal. She's also the owner of Bingsha Shatabdi, a publishing house in Kolkata. She is the translator of several major French writers, including Tahar Benjeloun, André Velter, and J.M.G. Leclésio. Seminarist on history and heritage in France, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and India, she's a person of many accomplishments. She was appointed Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres by the French government in 2014. The presence of Madame Kanchana Mukhopadhyay among us tonight is not only a testimony of the rich bonds existing between India, Bengal, and the Francophone world. It is also the promise of many more strong links to develop between us in the future. Thank you for being with us here tonight. Now, I would like to say a few words about Debasish. I'm overjoyed to be with Debasish for the launch of his book. I met Debasish in May 2015 in Paris at the sorry 11th conference on héritage et rupture. Dr. Geetha Dorè, organizer of the conference, had asked me to introduce him when he delivered his plenary lecture entitled In the City They Come and Go, Dialogical Modernism in Indian English Poetry. I still vividly remember his references to art history to explain Indian poetry in the context of the post-independence period. I also heard him read his poems for the first time during a poetry reading at the end of the conference. Geetha Ganapathy Dorè had shared some of his poems with me, and I had already read him before we met. Geetha was so enthusiastic and keen to publish a French translation of his poetry, and I was immediately struck by the power of his images, their originality, as well as a distinctive rhythm. The Marché de la Poésie, a yearly open-air event in Paris, was taking place shortly after that. I still see Geetha and myself sitting to talk about Debashish's poetry. We both knew it would take some time for the book to be born. However, we were not the only ones to be caught by his poetry. Indeed, several renowned literary journals, such as Siècle XXI, Europe, and La Traductière, immediately responded to the poems in translation we sent them. These publications were like candle lights we could send Debasish as a proof that it was only a matter of time before we could show him his book in French. They also gave us heart as we went on translating his poems, the poems that you can now read in Paysages sans Verbes. Habib Tengour was starting his collection Poèmes du Monde at Apic Éditions, a prominent publisher in Algeria. When he invited me to send him a manuscript, I was honored and thrilled. It seemed such a beautiful idea to publish poems from all over the world, to make them available to Algerian readers. I felt it was a wonderful way to circumvent the traditional geographies ruled by the notions of center and periphery. Habib was paving the way for exciting literary perspectives. Soon after the first batch of books was published for Poèmes du Monde, I mentioned Debashish's poetry to Habib, and he immediately showed great interest. But please, let us listen to Debasish reading one of his poems. Habib will then read it in French translation. We are listening to you, Debasish.
Thank you so much, Cecile. The poem that I would read first for all of us here and for the audience listening is a poem called Before the Sphinx of Tanis. Of course, we know this very famous piece of architectural marvel from ancient Egypt in the Louvre Museum in Paris. It's written when I was there for the first time in 2015, as Cecile was referring to. So this is the poem that I would begin with. And of course, in this particular poem, one thing is very evident. The geography of the city of Paris. I did not explain it to anyone who has ever been there, even seen photographs of that place, would really understand the trajectory of my images in this particular poem, the second half of my poem. So here for you is the poem Before the Sphinx of Tanis. Questions are putrid things, breath of 1,000 years of flesh eating and another 1,000 of soul making. A question may be cast in stone. Its answer is stranded in a high wind. You can trap a sphinx in a cellar. Its question will flow like vintage down the embroidery of islands that are our days, like a river. But the river will always be living.
You want me to read all the poems, Cecile? In French
Juste
or...
le poème que Debasish vient de lire, le Sphinx.
Oui.
Et il se trouve à la page
Oui,
50.
ça y est, je l'ai. Les questions sont choses nauséabondes. Le souffle d'un millier d'années passé à manger la chair et un autre millier à faire une âme. Une question peut être moulée dans la pierre. Sa réponse s'échoue par grand vent. On peut piéger un sphinx dans une cave. Sa question coulera comme un grand cru le long de cette broderie d'îles que sont nos jours, comme une rivière. Mais la rivière sera toujours l'été.
Thank you so much for your reading. Are there any reactions before I introduce the panelists or questions about this poem, this beautiful poem?
Well, for me, when Cecile sent me the manuscript, I was very interested. You hear me? Oui.
Yes.
Yeah, we
I
can hear
was
you.
interested by the poems in English, and the translation was really a good translation. And so, for me, it's sometimes difficult. Sometimes you can read in English, it's really beautiful, and the translation is not good. But this translation, I think Cecile and Geetha, they kept the sound of the poem. And so I am very proud to have this book, because for the collection, I want to have a big, éventail, an éventail.
A wide range.
Oui, of poet of the world. Now I have American, Arabian from Libya, Lebanon, Morocco, French, Italian, and India, it's really good. So I have in India, and I hope to have also India, but written in Bangla or other languages from India. It will be really wonderful to have it, because I am also interested by the calligraphy of the writing and the poem written, because the collection is bilingual. And so you can read, for the people who can read the text, it's really a good thing. And for me, it's also to show to young Algerian poets that the complexity of poetry in the world, and also the unity of this poetry. Because now, in the old days, all the poets were, they had, in genealogy, when, for example, in the 19th century, all the poets in French had to learn Greek and Latin, and the poetry was attached with classical, and the references were always to classical poetry. But in the 20th century, it's not vertical but horizontal reality, and all the poets now, we correspond with other poets in the world, in America, in India, in China, And the poetry now have to be in this, it's not with the old past, but with the present and with the languages, how to traduce poetry in his language, hearing the other languages. And it's what interests me, and to give this to young people in Algeria, because Algeria, we have no money for the books. And I also thanks the poets, because poets give, and translator also gives me the poems without demanding money, and because also in Algeria money has no value. So it's really, and it's really difficult to do this, because we have problems to have papers, to have ink, to have many problems. But, well, and the corona is also a big problem, the biggest now. So I am, what I say, really the poetry of Debasish has this tonality inscribed, on peut dire inscribed,
Yeah.
inscribed in the world, and in the sensibility of our time.
So Habib is a very discreet person.
Excuse me,
I
because
must
my English
introduce
is not
you.
fluent.
I'm just going to
I
interrupt you
understand.
because I haven't introduced you yet. So Habib has been my friend for many years. He is considered a leading voice in contemporary Algerian and French poetry. His writings draw on Algerian culture. He's also a sociologist and anthropologist. Habib was born in Mostaganem in eastern Algeria. His family moved to France when he was 5, and he grew up in a working class household. He studied sociology in France and completed his studies in Algeria at Constantine University. Although his work draws heavily on Algerian traditions, he writes mainly in French. His first published work was a book of surrealist poetry. He is the author of many landmark books, narratives, plays, and books of poems. He has been translated into several languages and has had very close links with Germany in particular, where he also was writer in residence on 2 or 3 occasions, if I'm correct. And I would like to mention 2 books he published this year: Ta voix vit, nous vivons, Your Voice Lives On, We Are Alive, and La Sandale d'Empédocle, Empedocles' Sandal. I wanted to insist on the way Habib manages to be the editor of this collection and carry on with his writing. He has just explained that he felt the urge to create a collection where he would publish major voices from France and other countries. Undaunted by the challenges, he has worked relentlessly to get the books published and try to make them available for Algerian readers, and also travel across borders. And it's not always easy to have the book come to France or other countries. He has just told you that his aim is to bring to French poetry lovers the best of both French poetry and other languages through translations. And I know this project is very dear to him. And I would like to pay tribute to his dedication and the generous work he has been doing as an editor while pursuing his own writing. So I wanted to say this, and sorry for interrupting, but it was important.
Thank you. You know, my wish is not only to translate in French, but also to translate in Arabic and the Berberian language, Tamazigh. But, you know, I don't, because when I was born, it was colonial. Algeria was France. So for me, Arab language was forbidden in school. I only learned French. But I speak Arabic, and I can also read Arabic because I also studied, but not in primary school or high school. I am autodidact in Arabic, so I can't have a good, I can judge the translations in Arabic or in Tamazight, but in French, I can do it. So for me, I did this collection only in France, but I told to many friends, but I said, oh, it's too difficult to do it. Well, it's like this. They want to do their own work. They have, how to say, leur propre carrière. But for me, I think now I am old now because, well, I write for a long time, 50 years. So I say I have to give something to the young people in Algeria. So it's how I think. Voilà.
Well, I would like to introduce Mary. Dr. Mary Noonan is lecturer in French at the University College of Cork, where she teaches modern and contemporary French theatre, contemporary French cinema, and French poetry. Her research focuses on the work of French women playwrights and filmmakers, on voice and the auditory in theatre, and on contemporary poetic practice and the translation of poetry. She draws on a range of theoretical approaches in her work, including psychoanalytical theory, phenomenology, and feminist theory. Her research monograph echoes voice the theatres of Sarraute, Duras, Sixtus, and Renaud, was published in 2014 by Legenda. Also in 2014, she was awarded funding to develop a project on poetry and translation as part of UCC's Creative Campus initiative. Her project, This Dust of Words, Poetry and as Translation, saw a number of international poets along with their translators throughout the autumn of 2015. Mary Noonan is also a published poet. Her first collection of poems, The Fado House, published at Daedalus Press 2012, was shortlisted for both the Shimshine Prize for a first collection 2013 and the Strong Shine Award 2013. She is the current poetry editor of the online literary journal Southword. Her second collection of poetry, Stone Girl, was published by Daedalus Press in February 2019. Stone Girl was shortlisted for the Derek Walcott Poetry Prize in 2020. We are listening to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Cecile, for that very kind introduction. So I'll say a few things. First of all, just to follow on from what was just said, before I come to you, Debasish, and your wonderful poetry, I would just like to pay tribute to Habib Tengour, and following from what Cecile said. I mean, we are, I suppose, today talking about the translation of poetry, and I suppose translation is an act of generosity, you know, and I think it was Paul Ricoeur who said that translation was linguistic generosity and or hospitality. I think he used the word hospitality, you know, and it is an act of great generosity of the spirit. And as you mentioned, Habib, of course, it's also, even in monetary terms, it's often very small units that try to do these gargantuan tasks like you're doing, you know, bringing all these international poets into the French language so that people in your country, in Algeria, can read them. Now, that's an amazing act of generosity. As you said, Habib, it's by you, but also by the poets and translators who give their work and their time and everything. So it really is a wonderful enterprise, and to be celebrated and saluted. Now, I mean, I have only been reading Debasish Lahiri's work for the past few weeks, but to use the contemporary term, I've been quite blown away by the work. I actually find it very beautiful. Picking up again on something you said, Cecile, the power of the images and the distinctive rhythm. And I was very taken with that as well. You know, there are many things, I suppose, I could say about Debashish's poetry, but the first thing I would say is that at a craft level, it seems to me, I mean, I'm not the world's expert on poetry, but I am somebody who reads poetry, who has studied it all my life and who is also writing it. So for me, it's very controlled. It has a real sense of form and craft. As you said, Cecile, a very distinctive rhythm. So one feels, I certainly felt that I was in the hands of a very consummate, distinguished poet, somebody who really knows what they're doing, you know, in poetry. And that is, you know, fantastic, first of all, because there is an awful lot of poetry out there and not all of it is as well achieved as Debashish's is, it seems to me. So I was very taken with it. And a poet that I kept thinking of when I was reading was Eliot, T.S. Eliot. Certain elements, and I think I read that you liked Eliot Debashish and that you were influenced maybe at one point by him, but you know, the wasteland, for example, what the thunder said, and something that strikes me in Debashish's poetry as well is the quality of silence. You know, that the poet is a witness, a silent witness, and in his poems, he is a poet of the city. I mean, one thinks of Baudelaire immediately, the flaneur. It's the city at night very often, but it is the city usually anyway, and it's many cities in India, but also cities in Europe. But the poet, or the persona, let's say, in the poems, is the silent witness to what's going on, and also is a kind of a cipher, maybe, or a medium through which the city passes, you know, so that the poet is open to all the influences of the city. And in order to do that, the poet remains very quiet. And one can feel that silence there. I mean, the lines are very controlled. They're quite short, actually. And there's quite a sense of the blank space around. These are not poems that are, I mean, they're very dense and they're very rich, but they don't feel overcrowded with words, which I think is very, it's a beautiful thing in poetry. If a poet can distill a lot of things down into this very rich kind of, but a purer essence where it can be quieter. The writing feels quiet because it's, you know, so there is that the silent witness in a way. And I was just looking up a part of T.S. Eliot's poem Burnt Norton, And in that poem, Eliot says, "At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point, there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered." And it really seemed to me to be describing Debashish's poetry, because there is that kind of still point of the turning world, which, as Eliot says, paradoxically isn't really still, because it's not fixity, it's moving. And it brings together, well, the past and the future. And there's a huge reflection on history in Debashish's poetry, as well as being very rooted in the contemporary. And that's very impressive, you know. And the other thing that I loved was more the Rimbaud. Again, all of my references are French, more or less, so I apologize for that. But, you know, the Rimbaud as the visionary, the poet as visionary, and, you know, the Lettres aux Voyants, you know, which Rimbaud, as the young poet, wrote, the idea that poetry is I kind of, what was the quotation? The reasoned derangement of the senses, but a derangement, but which is very reasoned and very controlled. So for me, Debashish's poetry is very sensory, very sensual. It's about the body, but it's also about the spirit, you know, or the soul. And so the poet, again, it's that idea of the poet being open, like a sieve, comme un passoire, and all of these elements, because, you know, so the elements of the city, like buildings, they can pass through the flesh of the poet, but also he's very attuned to the movement of time. Even within the day, you know, the movements of the light, you know, the images of light on the buildings in the morning and then in the evening. And so that, I mean, time is a huge presence in his work as well. There is the anxiety of time, maybe, but something more than that. You know, I suppose Debashish, it seems to me, is an old soul, you know, and he's very open to the dead and to the souls of the dead. I think he can feel them when he's walking around the city, and his poetry is very porous to the dead, to the past. And so, well, there's so much going on, you know, in the work. I think it's a fantastic, it's fantastic writing, because it's very rooted in India, but it's incredibly open to Europe. And so there is this dialogue going on through the poet between these two worlds, you know, and that's absolutely fantastic. So you can take it that I'm a fan, and I'm just so delighted to have discovered this poet, you know, and I thank Habib and Cecile and the other translator, and of course Debashish himself, who, you know, is an immensely talented poet. You know, I'm very impressed, basically. And by the way, before I finish, the translations are fantastic. And you said that, Habib, as well. I mean, I think Cecile is a poet, and I don't know if Geetha, Ganapathy, Dorè is also a poet, but certainly for me, there is a huge poetic sensibility in the translations. And Debashish's poetry is actually very musical. There's a huge musicality in it, you know, and the translations are doing that as well. And they are achieving the same kind of control as the originals. So they are a pleasure to read in French, for me. And I actually really enjoyed the translations. So that's what I would say, just, as my contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for your subtle analysis of Debashish's poetry. And when you spoke of a silent witness, when you spoke of his place of history in his poetry, when you spoke of T.S. Eliot, all this I find so true. You've exactly pinpointed the specificity of his poetry. Thank you very much. I will now turn to Andy, and we can go on discussing all together after I've introduced everyone, after everyone has spoken. So I would like to welcome Dr. Andy Stafford, a specialist in critical theory, and in particular the work of Roland Barthes and the photo text. His other areas of expertise are African and Caribbean literature, politics and historiography, the essay, and other short forms. He has been senior lecturer in French studies at Leeds since 2003. He was visiting professor at the University of Paris 13 in 2019 and 2020. He's a member of the editorial board of Barthes Studies, as well as the Revue Roland Barthes. He's also a member of the Équipe Barthes at the Institut des Textes et Manuscrits in the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. He has published numerous books on Roland Barthes, including Roland Barthes and Greece and Ancient and Modern, published by the University of Cardiff in 2019. He's also the author of numerous journal articles. His chapter on Abdelkebir Khatibi and the Souffle years is due to appear in a volume co-edited by Khalid Yamla'i and Jane Hiddleston, to be published by Liverpool University Press. Now, Andy, we are listening to you. If I can't see you on the screen. Is Andy with us?
I think Andy is having technical issues. We can. He's been trying to log in for quite a few times, I think.
Yes.
We can listen to Joe first, and maybe by the time Joe has finished, Andy will be able to join us.
Okay, perhaps. So I will introduce Joe now. So I have a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Joseph Ford, a lecturer in French studies at the University of London. He is director at the Center for the Study of Cultural Memory at the Institute of Modern Languages Research. His research interests include colonies and colonization, emigration and immigration, cultural memory, culture, globalization and development, literatures in a modern language, both in Africa and Europe. He specializes in contemporary French and Francophone literature and culture, and more specifically Algeria and the Algerian Civil War or Black Decade of the 1990s. His wider areas of research also include postcolonial studies, world literature, literary translation, and French and Francophone intellectual culture of the 20th and 21st centuries. He is the author of a monograph entitled Writing the Black Decade, Conflict and Criticism in Francophone Algerian Literature, published at Lexington Books in 2021. It studies how literature and the way we read, classify, and critique literature impacts our understanding of the world at a time of conflict through the way we read and the way literature is classified and critiqued. We are listening to you, Joe. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly so.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Cecile, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, Debasish, for the invitation to come along and celebrate the launch of your poetry today. And thanks, Habib, again for convening this collection of poetry, which just seems such a fantastic idea and a fantastic collection. When I was asked to come along today, and when I started reading Debasish's collection of poems, I began to wonder how this relationship between the publisher and the poet had come about, between the editor and the poet had come about. And obviously, Habib, you and Cecile, indeed, you've kind of elaborated on those points already. So I have a kind of a response to my question. But then in thinking about that, I suppose I wanted to suggest that the kind of relationship, the kind of transnational relationship that we have here might make us or help us to rethink some of our received ideas about the post-colonial or the local and the global, or about world making, and how those ideas have been articulated in relation to, in particular, Algeria and perhaps India as well. So my own specialism is North Africa, so I'll probably try and pose a series of questions around that context. So I suppose that they're not necessarily directed at either Debasish or Habib, but rather I hope they can kind of open up a bit of a discussion later. So one of the things I did think about when I first saw this volume was the transcolonial, which is a notion first articulated by Françoise Lyonnais and Shumisi in their book Minor Transnationalism. And for Lyonnais and she, the transcolonial is about shared but differentiated experiences of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And another critic, more recently, Olivia Harrison, has taken up this concept. And Olivia Harrison suggests that the transcolonial highlights cultural and political alliances and exchanges across the formerly colonized world in order to illuminate the modalities and contours of the post-colonial condition from a comparative perspective. I'm quoting from Harrison there. So to put this as a question, as a first question, perhaps, I wonder, can we think of this collection of poems, this wonderful collection of poems that I thoroughly enjoyed reading, can we think of this collection of poems and the series that brings them to Algeria, and the series is of course called Poèmes du Monde, as an example of the transcolonial? So that's my first question. At the same time, I was quite curious about this, the title of the collection that Habib's editing, Poèmes du Monde, and especially in the context, as we spoke about briefly before, the context of the Algiers publishing market at the moment, which has very much shown itself to be a very innovative, avant-garde space when it comes to some of the most recent work of writers and poets published in the city. And in many ways, I think this publishing space resists the kinds of narratives that we hear a lot about the global dominance of Paris and London and New York publishing markets. And I think it's very interesting to, as it were, watch this space, and also to think about, to think more historically as well. So to think about the rich history of cultural encounter, of diversity, of exchange that occurs in the region of the Maghreb of North Africa. So my question about the transcolonial feeds into a broader question about how the Maghreb, and maybe this is to Habib and perhaps to Cecile, the translator, how the Maghreb in particular is a kind of global space for this kind of poetic work. So to what extent then can we see this South-South connection between India and North Africa and Algeria in particular as a challenge to dominant ideas around how literature circulates along those old colonial lines between metropole and colony? To what extent is Algiers establishing itself as a new global center for publishing? And how do initiatives such as the Poèmes du Monde force us to rethink our definitions of how literature and poetry circulate in the world, but also how poetry, and I think this has been hinted at already, how poetry and the power of poetry to make or remake our worlds and our common modes of reference in relation to the world. And the poems here, and this is what struck me most when I was reading them, they're a product of travel, it seems to me, a product of travel through space and time. As the poet thinks very, very deeply about questions of place, history, historical figures, and imaginaries, as Mary has already said. But time is also something of a recurrent theme in the poems, and the perception or question of time is clearly at the core of the kinds of worlds we might want to imagine or remake through poetry. And I was very struck in that final interview, and I was very appreciative of the final interview with the poet, where Debasish speaks of a peur du temps, a fear of time that's built into human beings as they become adults, as they grow into adulthood. And the poet's rejection of clock time, if we could call it that, brought me back to several of the poems within the collection, and in particular the penultimate stanza of that poem, The Stopped Clock at Chowringhee. I'll just read that stanza. But beware of working clocks, their works and days transfix time with motion. And of course then, that leads me to the title of the poems, Paysages sans Verbes, landscapes without verbs, which strikes me here as also relating to this link between time and motion, time and movement. And the verb implies action and movement, but it strikes me that it might not be fully removed from the poetry here, as the title suggesting. Rather, and Debasish, perhaps we can talk about this. My question is the verb to be understood here as always already a part of place and space, rather than are we talking about a verb or movement that kind of is already a fundamental part of place and space and doesn't need distinguishing? To go back to the poem, the same poem I just quoted, a stopped clock, this is the first line, a stopped clock mirrors time as a moving one can never do. Is that because time captured in the moving clock is a construct of time and motion, movement, perhaps labor, that is charged with fear and anxiety, and from which the poet wants to consciously move his readers away? In other words, is there some other time, as I'm already hinting at, perhaps embedded within space in such a way that the two, space and time, cannot be separated or alienated from one another? So I wonder whether what we have here in this wonderful collection of poetry is really an example of the transcolonial, or rather something that testifies to a much longer history of transcultural exchange, and indeed builds on that history and projects into the future. Is what we have here between Lahiri's brilliant poems, the Algerian publisher Apic, the series led by Habib Tengour, and the translators, of course, one of whom is with us today, Cecile. Is this precisely an example of what, and it did remind me of, I think he's already been mentioned today, Abdelkabir Khatibi. It's a reminder of the Moroccan critic and writer and poet Abdelkabir Khatibi, all the way back in 1983. He spoke of the Maghreb tel qu'il est, a Maghreb as it is. And I'll just read the English. Topographical site between East, West, and Africa, and such that it can become global for its own account. In other words, the Maghreb re-establishing itself or establishing itself, or in some kind of continuity, let's say, with history as a globalizing space of encounter for writing, for poetry, for art, that has a genuine world-making force. Or rather, I then think, is the poem itself a unit within which that spatio-temporal rethinking of the world can occur? And that struck me very much from reading your poetry, Debasish. I'm going to stop there, but obviously I can go back over those questions if you'd like me to. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I was really impressed by what you said about the transcultural, because it exactly mirrors what I felt when Habib first told me about his collection, Poèmes du Monde, when he was founding his collection. But I think Habib may want to speak, and then Debasish about space and time. So Habib, if you want to answer about the transcultural, and then Debasish about space and time and this very rich intervention we've just had.
Maybe I could explain it better in French, but I try to speak in English. For me, when I begin with the collection, I didn't thought about transcolonial or so. It was just, for me, all the foreigners doesn't exist. When I read a poet, he is Algerian for me. I can read Eliot, Tolstoy, Tagore. When I read it and I enjoy it, he is Algerian for me. So it is what I want to give to the young people, because the reader is the proprietor of the books. And if you can be Algerian or French. Baudelaire disait, oui, je suis français, enfin, je suis né français par hasard. It's, you don't choose how to be. So I am Algerian, and I am proud to be Algerian because I was born. In my time, we had a big dream of Algeria, of Maghreb, but now it's not the same thing. But we had a big dream with a society, democratic, liberal, but, well, it's problem, politics. I don't want to speak about politics. Only with poetry, Poèmes du Monde, it was just a joke, because Aragon had a collection in Gallimard, Du Monde Entier, ou Lettres du Monde, something like this in Gallimard. And I said, yeah, Poème du Monde is also a Poème du Monde Entier. Sandrars had Du Monde Entier à l'autre bout, something like this, Du Monde Entier. And for me, I know many poets from England, America, Africa, many countries. And I said, well, I know so many poets, and I want to share my knowledge with the young people, because, well, it's how to say, it's richesse, a power also I have, and I want to share it with young people, because other people can do this. And when I choose poets, it's always living poets. So I know them, or I know the translator, and I speak with the translator or with the poet. And for me, it is a friendship, you know, comment dire? Yes, it is a friendship operation, une opération amicale, si on veut. And maybe, because you can't think that it is, yes, transcolonial or something like this, but it was not the first thinking I had. What I had, it is only how to have the best poets in the world. I know I have many. The first was Michel de Guy, is an old one, big, and I have many poets, and they are not known in Algerian. From the young poets, they don't know those poets. And so I think it's a pity you can't know those poets, because the books can't come in Algeria. You can't have books from, they cost so much. And only people who go to France or England or America can have the books. But in Algeria, you can't have the books. it's not a censor, but it's only money. They have not money to buy those books. And I said, if I can have a collection, an Algerian one, with original books in Algeria, they became Algerian. You know, the nationality of the book is not the author, but the publisher. It's, for example, our writers, the biggest, Mohammed Dib, Katib Yassin, Khatibi, they are considered as French because the edition is Gallimard, Le Seuil, and they are French. And so if I have American, English, Indian poets in Algeria, they are Algerian. And so it is, how to say, Algeria, I think that Algeria can be also a center. It's a dream because it's not real because of politics, but I can feel it as a center of world poetry. And I dream also to have an international festival of modern poetry, because we have many festivals of poetry, but it is always, you know, oral poetry, old poetry, classical poetry, and modern poetry. People, they don't know what is the modern poetry. And so if I can share this with young people and they can see and read those poems and maybe think about the colonial system, transcolonial, hybridité, how to share with the others. And so it's what I think.
Well, thank you, Habib. Just before Debasish speaks, I would like to add something because what you've just been saying reminds me of my Tunisian publisher who publishes my novels, Elisabeth Daldoul. And Elisabeth Daldoul said that she created her publishing house because she wanted books to circulate differently. She kept saying, why should we always count on France to send us the books? And she wants to open a new map. It's a sort of reshaping of the world that is going on as a reaction to what you were saying about the transcolonial, Joe.
And excuse me, Cecile, also because all the publishers, they want always novels. And you know, when I was young, I was really influenced by the surrealism. And I say there is only poetry, and I don't like prose, I don't like novels. And so poetry is the future of the writing. And so I said to my publisher, because poetry, maybe you can't have money, but you have more than money. Because when you work about writing, only the poets are in the writing. And what is writing? L'écriture.
Yeah, there is a very special quality in the relationships that develop among the poets too. I notice it.
And if you have the poets, you can enter in the sensibility of the world, of the countries, because every poet has, you know, express, yeah, the soul of his country, of his world, of his people, and you can see it, and you can be more, because yes, we can have relation between each other in the poetry, and so it is what and also when you have good poetry in other languages, the poets in Algeria, they have to confront their writing to the other and to do their best.
Thank you, Habib. Debasish, the second part of the question was for you about space and time and many other things.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Joe. I will try and answer the question with regard to the title of the book, Landscape Without Verbs. And Joe was was thinking on those lines. What does the presence or the absence of a verb, a call to action almost, what does it do to a landscape, and why do I import that in the title? Well, part of the question has been answered by Joe himself when he said that perhaps it's movement. I mean, movement is ingrained in any scenery, any scenery. The beautiful that one picks out, the picturesque that one picks out, the moving or the arresting, whatever it is. And sometimes that might not be the picturesque, actually. Might be something sordid, something shocking as well in a scene. Whatever it is that moves the sensibility of that particular writer, in this case, me, myself, I have to understand that there is already, always, as to again use Joe's expression, something that is evanescent in all of this, something that is already fleeting, moving, and it is a gesture on my part through language to somehow arrest that, still that, even if for a moment. And I think that capture is art, that capture is the poem, the poetry. So the cessation of action, even for a moment, one moment, if I could possibly do that. Whether I can do that is another matter altogether, but the idea that it might be performed by the use of language, by the way I use language. Therefore, a landscape without a verb emerges. That very fragile, momentary, sudden occurrence of a landscape without verbs, which is, again, as I said, a very fleeting moment. To capture the fleeting is, I think, one of those grand objectives of art. It's always been like that. In the past, now, I think all the time. Whether it's photography, whether it's any other thing, it's the idea that this is not going to stay, this is not going to remain as it is. And perhaps the poet tries desperately to give us that little moment, if possible, little peek into that moment, what happened over there. And I know this is a kind of a pathetic fallacy, the poet thinking that he can still eternity. I mean, of course, we have grown up reading Keats's poetry, where he says that if he could do that, but then that is again in Keats's poetry, it's a celebration of failure. I think in his great Grecian Urn Ode, which we have all read with such great wonder when we were children, and that remains in my poetry as well. It's just an attempt. But probably with the notion that you would probably fail in doing it. It's the quality of the failure, not the quality of the success, that makes the poetry, I think. So Cecile, with your permission, of course, if I might, and since Joe has already alluded to that poem twice in his opening comments, I will read that poem, The Stopped Clock at Chowringhee. I actually thought about this reading. And Cecile kind of suggested that you can read about 4 poems. So I said that, and Cecile gave me the liberty, the freedom to choose my poems. So what I chose was 4 poems, which 2 of them would obviously be related to my experiences in France. The first one was at the Louvre. I will end with another poem which talks about my experience in France, in Paris, to be more precise. And in between, I'll have 2 poems nestled in between, which talk about my own city. This one is about my own city, Kolkata, and about another poem that I'm going to read, of course, time permitting, about Madurai, another city with which Cecile relates a lot, because she has been there. I think she has been there. She's been in the southern part of India a long time ago, but she has been there. And she told me that she had a real connection with that poem, meaning that she was there and she could almost visualize it, some parts of the scenery and then the weather that it talks about. So without further ado, this is the poem called The Stopped Clock at Chowringhee. And perhaps after I finish reading the English original, Cecile or Habib might read the French translation. A stopped clock mirrors time as a moving one can never do. The turning arms of a clock that probe and jab at the jaw of light, or the soft pink darkness of starless nights, far above streetlights, especially at dawn when the night forgets light a while. Between a hopeful wave, perhaps of recognition, or a circular heft of the hand, the opportunity of remembering lost for now. makes living an anodyne for the bruise of minutes, makes breathing a system of measurement. Stopped clocks in city squares like broken wind vanes seesawing in a high wind, pointing to earth and heaven alternatively, mark time as a morality play where to act is to err. Or else why do Dali and De Chirico's clocks play patience with piazzas with a poker face? Beware of working clocks. Their works and days transfix time with motion. We move out of cities with stopped clocks. There is no escaping those with moving ones.
Thank you. Habib is going to read the translation of.
Oui, et tu liras, Madura, que tu voulais lire. L'horloge arrêtée à Chauringhi. Une horloge arrêtée pénètre le temps, comme jamais ne peut le faire une horloge qui tourne. Les aiguilles d'une horloge qui explore et pénètre, telle une sonde, la mâchoire de la lumière, ou la pénombre rose et douce des nuits sans étoiles, loin au-dessus des lampadaires de la rue, surtout à l'aube, lorsque la nuit oublie un peu la lumière, entre un signe d'espoir, peut-être de reconnaissance, et un geste circulaire de la main, la possibilité de s'en souvenir perdu pour le moment, mettent du baume à la vie, car la meurtrissure des minutes fait de la respiration un système de mesure. Des horloges arrêtées dans des squares de ville, comme des girouettes cassées qui oscillent sous un vent fort et indiquent tantôt le ciel et tantôt la terre, marquent le temps comme une moralité où jouer revient à se tromper. Sinon, pourquoi les horloges de Dali et de Chirico feraient-elles des jeux de patience avec des piazzas au visage de poker? Méfiez-vous des horloges qui marchent. Leur travail et les jours transpercent le temps avec le mouvement. Nous sortons des villes dotées d'horloges arrêtées, mais il n'y a pas moyen d'échapper à celles dont les horloges tournent. It's really beautiful poem.
Debasish, can I ask a question?
You have the sensibility of Dali, Chirico. I can see the painting of the clockwork. It's really interesting. And also, because, in Algeria also, we have in the square clockwork, but they are stopped. And you see, there's no time, you can't see the time. And yeah, it's really, and you have, it is, Mallet said it, que c'est de sensibilité, c'est la quiétude. Une quiétude et une nostalgie, mais pas triste. It's not sadness, but just how to see something just like, bluesy sometimes. Voilà.
Debasish, can I add something?
Of course.
I'm sorry you can't see me. I've had awful technical trouble, so if I could just ask a question, please. Following on from what Habib said, and particularly what Mary said about, I was very struck by when Mary said that she felt, I'm sure you took this the right way, that you seem to have a connection with the dead. This sort of, when you walk around a city, you have this feeling of being, at first I had to do a double take, but I'm sure you took that in the way that Mary meant it, which I think is a real sensitivity. And what I really felt like in reading and listening to what Mary and Habib and Joseph have said, I really felt like you're a poet of catastrophe. And particularly that poem about Mahabalipuram. And I happen to have been to Mamallapuram in 2000. And I feel like your poem is trying to say something about catastrophe that's taken place in a very sacred part of, for Hindus in India, which is Mamallapuram, which is now destroyed by the catastrophe of the of the tsunami of 2004. And I was really struck by the poem, thinking back to when I was there. And I hadn't been back to see what happened, but shrines and many, Hindu artifacts and religious symbols have been destroyed by that flood. So I was really struck by the poem. On the sands of Mahabharata Puram, sheer rock softened into the dance of Shiva. The repose of Vishnu, rocks become art by listening to the sun's obad and dreaming on the crest of the sea's lullaby. Now, for me to say that you're a poet of catastrophe, that might not come across in the softness of that poem, but catastrophe for me seems to run through the Paysages sans Verbes, the landscape without words, because of the flooding. And I feel like flood is an important part of what your poems are trying to evoke and also to alert us to. I also felt like in The Afternoon Drive, certainly a poem about Walter Benjamin and the catastrophe that Benjamin sees by looking at the past and seeing where each of us, in history have arrived at. And I felt like Afternoon Drive was some kind of homage to what Benjamin is saying about catastrophe. So I don't mean catastrophe because it makes your poems aggressive or violent or studied with moments of fear, but there's a kind of impending catastrophe seems to float through. And I think what Mary read from T.S. Eliot was very much about that movement within fixity that catastrophe represents. It brings me on nicely to ask a question to Cecile. I think Cecile is very important in this whole debate, because at one moment you have this biblical use of English where you say killeth, and I'll just read you the moment. The word killeth, ETH at the end of kill, it killeth afresh. Debasish. You can't ask somebody in French to translate that because they can't. Cecile, would you like to comment on that? I think the French is le mot tu. You've lost the biblical in the English.
Well, I think all translation implies that sort of confrontation with moments when you must choose, make choices, either the music or being so close to the text that something is lost. And here, with the killeth, indeed, in French, we can't reflect this killeth. So the choice was obviously the choice of the music of the poem. We did lose something in the translation with this killeth. It's true.
Also, while you're there, Cecile, where there's a wonderful moment where the poem refers to Verlaine, and I noticed this is in Debasish's other collection, Poppies in the Post. Is that right, Debasish? That poem.
That's right.
Is in there
That's
as
right.
well. And in the French,
Absolutely.
in the English, it's rain rhymes with Verlaine. There's a slight poetic license. So Mary's laughing. The rain rhymes with Verlaine, as we know, of course, in French it's Verlaine. But in English, the rain does rhyme with Verlaine. With Verlaine.
Yeah.
Cecile, you can't translate that.
It was difficult not to forget. Well, I had in mind the music of Verlaine's French poem in French, and what Debasish made of it, which was quite a feat. I was really impressed by the way his music, his own music, reflects the music of a French poem with differently, but it's all again a question of music.
Thank you. That's my questions, Debasish. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I do apologize for my technical difficulties.
Cecile, if you permit me to say, I just want to assure Andy Stafford in a particular matter, if you permit me 1 or 2 minutes. As Andy has said that he has visited Mahabalipuram and he is fearing that the tsunami has devastated the sculptures. On the contrary, it was a bliss for Mahabalipuram because after the tsunami, not new, obviously an old 9th, 7th or 8th century Durga temple has surfaced after the tsunami.
After the
And
tsunami.
after the tsunami, it was previously under some sand, but after the tsunami, it has again surfaced. So, at least for Mahabalipuram, it was not a devastating, rather a blessing tsunami. I
Thank
just
you,
wanted,
thank
I just
you.
wanted to assure him.
Thank
In
you.
which
This is
case,
so
I will definitely go
interesting.
back to Mamalapuram.
Yeah, because I saw it last in 2019, just before the pandemic, and I was from 88. I'm continuously going there 7 to 8 times, and I was so happy to see that. I wanted to assure you, that's all.
Thank you.
And Madame Kanchana, I realized that we haven't heard you speak. Perhaps I was too fast, and you intended to speak, to say something.
Actually, I am feeling very incompetent in this erudite conference. I am telling you very frankly, because I can give you some glimpses of what I have understood from Debashish's poem. Number one, the first thing when I read the caption of the title of his book, it reminded me of the first writing of a very famous Bengali writer, Sunil Gangopadhyay, who finally became the president of our Academy of Letters, Maya Kanonir Phul. I took it literally. I took it in the literary sense. In Maya Kanonir Phul, there was no verb. So Paysages sans verb, I always thought there is no verb when I got the name first. But secondly, which I felt, Debashish reminded me of another poet, another professor of English, who used to write in Bangla, Jivanananda, because the way nature comes in his poetry, I found, though Jivanananda never wrote in English, very few, but he is famous for his Bangla writing. This is what I appreciated very much. These are the two similarities I found with Bengali poets. And otherwise, I'm very impressed. As I was telling you, that for me, Debashish appeared as the poet, as the troubadour, as if he is writing a musical travelogue, because he was dwelling between the past and the present, between Europe and India. As you have said, Madurai, he has brought out the vibrant spirit of Madurai, then Mahabalipuram, and of course, he has gone to Europe, many places, but he is not stuck. He is not stuck in nostalgia, he is not stuck in the past. And the way he has portrayed our city, Calcutta, j'ai trouvé il n'est pas déraciné. Il est toujours en sa, he is always deep-rooted in our city life. I found the cityscape which he has portrayed is excellent, because we who lives in the dwellers of Calcutta, we know how Park Street Cemetery or Bow Barrack bring us the nostalgia. But at the same time, they're a living part of the city. They're not isolated, they're not deserted. And of course, the much discussed dysfunctional clock of Chaurangi. It is something which reminds me of our day to it brings us, it is not only the nostalgia for the past, not, as Habib said, it is not the sadness, separatists, but it is something which is moving. So I found his poetry is very pertinent to our contemporary society, and this is for the first time I have gone through it. I'm sure he will make a mark.
Kanchana, the one thing that is missing from India is French. When I went to Mamallapuram, I also went to Pondicherry, And Pondicherry, if you know, since the Carnatic Wars of the 18th century, was a French-speaking town, a French-speaking city, in fact. But now there is no French at all. And I wondered whether there's not been a tsunami of language destruction and from the, and not to be nostalgic in too much of a way, but as a Francophile, I find it a shame that that part of India no longer speaks French.
You're very right. It is only limited among the very few elite class and the future generation who are adopting French. It is a news eye perhaps for Habib, which will not make him happy. They're just learning it for their career, not for the love of the language or literature. This is a very unfortunate thing which I find, because when we learn French, we never thought to capitalize it. But I'm not saying it is bad, but it is the change. It is they are least interested in literature, be it contemporary, be it classical. They just want to, you can understand, they are taking courses in hotel management, business management, fashion designing, but true sense of literature and language, very few people are attracted in India. I'm reading Alliance Française for a long time. I see the students, and for me it is very grim, very grim. Very few people learn French for the love of the language, for the love of the literature or culture.
Cecile, with your permission, just to respond to Andy's comment a while ago. Andy, you might have seen this slight pain that I feel about this loss of diversity. You talked about Pondicherry and about it not being French anymore. I talked about this loss of diversity in Calcutta, because Calcutta was supposedly the truly cosmopolitan city. I mean, we had, and the two Beau Barracks poems, especially the first one, which talks about the Chinese community, the Chinese New Year celebrations over there. You can actually see a little thread of pain running through there, because they are such a threatened community these days, and their presence is becoming more and more minuscule. I mean, we were very proud. We had the Armenians, we had the Chinese, we had the Jews, we had the Portuguese, so many communities mixing and mingling with, and many of our best traditions actually in the city are borrowed from them, actually. The fact that we have such a grand Christmas and all the rituals surrounding it, it's to do with those people and what they gave us, the richness that they shared with us, the largesse, if I could use that word, the cultural largesse that they shared with us, which made us who we are. But now we are again returning back to a certain kind of ghettoism again, where diversity is being rooted out. So in that poem, of course, the first of the Beau Barracks poems in this particular volume, you can actually see that pain, that the evanescence, again, a kind of the scene that just flickers in front of you for a moment, perhaps, half nostalgia, half present, and then it's gone again. So again, I mean, it's a comment. It's not a large and heavy tome on history, but again, perhaps it's my way of crystallizing in a few words, in a few lines, perhaps, a comment about the history of our city as well, and its loss of diversity, the cultural diversity that once was.
I don't know if Joe would agree that, as somebody from the UK, the name Beau Barracks has a kind of colonial military connotation. It's odd that you should cite Beau Barracks in a kind of positive way, Debasish.
But that's how it has been. Whether we talk about in film, whether we talk about in poetry, in literature, for Calcuttans, that has been a real place for cosmopolitan partaking of very secular traditions of sharing culture, traditions, and all that sort of thing. We are, I think, as a world, we are moving towards a very dogmatic, a very fundamentalist, very narrow kind of perspective on things, on people. I think Beau Barracks is in Calcutta, in the Calcutta perspective. Name, I know, has a distinct colonial connotation, and of course, it's a throwback to British times. But what it has become, what it had become in independent India, as a symbol of free exchange, of free flowing of ideas, of a very hybrid nature of experiences coming and mingling together, a kind of melting pot. It was Calcutta's own version of the real melting pot. Park Street, of course. You see all those reflections. So again, Kanchanadi here can relate to that. That the coffee house on College Street, Park Street, Bow Barracks. I mean, these were places where really different elements of world culture came, subsisted together, thrived, intermingled, affected Bengali life and letters as well. So much so. So and all these are now on the wane. So it's almost as if there is in the poetry this tendency to, as I said, both to relive the past if possible only once, and also to reflect on the present. The second Bow Barracks poem is actually a reflection on what has happened to that community, in a year's time, what seemed so vibrant during the Chinese New Year, and how it is transformed a year later in a very different light, very different perspective. So I think it's all there.
Debasish, my experience of traveling in India and talking to Indian people was one of surprise when I expressed my regret for the way in which Britain colonized India, and yet I heard nobody in India say anything but praise for England and for UK and for Britain, particularly for the language. And I'm sure Mary would have comments upon that as somebody from Ireland. I'm sure Habib and Cecile would have comments in the French dimension, the Francophone dimension of that. It took me aback that in speaking to people in India about the past and the relationship between England, English, and India and colonization was always a positive one. I find that quite shocking as a post-colonial critic. I'm sure Joseph would know where I'm coming from.
I don't know if I would say it's the same in Ireland. I'm sure it's not. I mean, I don't think you'd find a very positive reaction to colonization, let's say, in contemporary Ireland. But I had a question for Debasish, just wondering about what you've just said there, Debasish. Why is there this ghettoization and this loss of that cultural diversity? Why is that happening now? Do you know? Why is the cultural diversity being lost? Is it an economic thing? It's to do with economics, basically.
It's not just economics. It's also a little bit of demography involved over here in Calcutta, especially in Calcutta. I mean, just to talk about the Chinese, because they figure in my poetry over here. Of course, India's relations with China have been at a low ebb ever since the 1960s war, against China. And as we all know about the kind of concentration camp in which they were put, because the Chinese were seen as spies largely, and they were herded together and taken over in a place in the desert in Rajasthan, and some of them managed to come back, not all of them. Some of them ran away back to their countries, went to Hong Kong and other places, settled in other places like Australia and Canada. Some of them went back to Canada. So the few who returned to Calcutta have a wonderful and moving story to relate, where they were living hand to mouth on the streets of Calcutta, literally. And later now, some of them have risen to become big businessmen, owners of big restaurants in Calcutta, Chinese restaurants in Calcutta. So, there's this... And the fact that if you go to the central part of Calcutta, Kanchanadi will know Tirta Bazaar and all the other places, which I refer to in my poems, Christopher Road, and because now there is the new Chinatown, which is near the Eastern Metropolitan Bypass in Hapa, and then there used to be the old one. Especially if you go to the old one, what you find is that the few Chinese pagodas which still stand over there are being surrounded by local populations, Bengali people or people from other northern parts of India who settle here. And Bihar, yes, to be more precise, absolutely. The thing is that they are, it's not that the Chinese people who live there or who practice their religious rites over there are actually poor or indigent or economically not viable and they have to move. But they're being threatened, actually. It's pure and simple threats that are being sent out. And these people are of dwindled numbers, and they can't really confront these other people, so they're being swamped out actually. And so what they think is that if their children go to school, they are being threatened, something else is happening every day. So they say that we do not need the trouble, we do not need the hassles, we'll give up our property, we'll not even charge any money, we'll just leave, just pack up our bags and leave. So and then in a few days that pagoda is demolished, part of it is demolished, it becomes a part of the shanty, the growing shanty in those parts. So it's how this has been happening consistently. And it is the same with the Jewish community and the same with the Armenians. The Armenians are now cooped up in Armenian college. So, they hardly come out, barely. They hardly mingle with the population. Although, if you go to Armenian church, it relates a completely different history, and how involved they were with city life in the past, and how they have again regressed into that little enclave of theirs inside the Armenian college. So, it's strange. It's sad and it's strange that this has happened. So a city that was so open, so accepting of different foreign influences, not just as not to be overrun by them, but to assimilate them, to give rise to a new, very enriched culture over here. And you were talking about Andy was talking about English and how I think this is an interesting sentiment. Whenever there is a debate, a political debate about different sides and different political regimes not being successful in governing the country, people, even today, they talk about, well, we were better under the British. They use this expression that we were better under the British. They were the best. So that is one thing. It's a common thread you will hear in India. And the other thing, of course, is that we use English guiltless. Now English is a very Indian language, and we are very passionate about the confrontations. I mean, Mary is here from Ireland, of course. We know about the confrontations, the actual physical, violent confrontations between the British Army and the Irish Republicans. We know that, the Irish freedom fighters, we know that. And we had a very powerful connection between freedom fighters here in Bengal and Irish freedom fighters, supply of arms and money. And, in fact, there was a trans-world collaboration at that point, in terms of a fight against the British Raj, against the British government, on two fronts, perhaps. So that being said, we are as passionate about our Binoy Badal and Dinesh. We are as passionate about our freedom fighters and about their struggle against the British and about what they did, the atrocities of the British rule in India. But we are also very familiar with the English language. I mean, call it a contradiction in terms, call it a conundrum. We use English just as a medium of expression, and we are so good at it. What Habib was saying, any poet I read in Algeria, sitting in Algeria, becomes Algerian. I mean, whether he belongs to a country that was an erstwhile colonizer, whether he belongs to a first world country or to a neighboring country, doesn't really matter. If I relate to a poet, if I read that poet, I assimilate him into my culture, into my identity as well. So somewhere in my identity as an Indian, as Habib's identity as an Algerian, a Shakespeare or a Verlaine or a Baudelaire or an Eliot or whoever figures prominently. So in that way, I think the old lines of the postcolonial are being slightly deranged, let's put it this way, or we're trying to erase or draw other lines of contact in between. Because as I told you, English is my language of choice. I mean, it's not that I started with, I am a Bengali, but English is as much my language, as naturally. I write it and think in English as naturally as I do in Bengali. And there is no divide. I mean, for a long time we had this debate, didn't we, about this fidelity issue, am I really Bengali? Or should all Bengalis be writing in Bengali? Should they not write in English? The guilt of writing in English. That's why I said that I use English. We use English, our generation, generations that have followed me, we use English guiltlessly. It's just a language. You get into the language, you get your heart out in the language, that's all fine. The fact that this was the language of the colonizer, and as even our books of theory we teach in colleges and universities, they talk about language of the colonizer. I don't think anyone who writes in English these days, in India at least, thinks on those lines. This is the language of the colonizer, and therefore we should abjure this language, we should not use this language. In fact, it's just the opposite. We should use it more to show that, yes, we are so comfortable with the language and we can express our own ideas, our own cultural traits, whatever it is, in that language. So it's as much ours now as maybe Bengali or Tamil or Telugu or Hindi or whatever, any other Indian language. It's our language. So I use English guiltlessly. I use English without that thought that there's a secret, invisible barrier between my Bangla and the English somewhere. I don't think so at all. So, for me, I have gone beyond that line, and I think my generation, even, and of course generations after me, we have gone beyond that line. So, we have had poets in India who have been very, full of facility in 2 languages, very easy. I can say the very famous name of Purun Kolatkar from India. Kolatkar was so familiar with, we know he's a major poet in the Indian modernist tradition in English, but he was also a very important Marathi poet. So, for him to just switch from Marathi to English and back to Marathi, it's no problem at all. No problem at all for him. So again, I think that the question of the English language and its use, I think, Andy, it doesn't exist anymore in India. And that does not mean that we do not feel very strongly about what happened during the 200 years of colonial rule in India. What happened? The scriptures, the structures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem is that Habib and Cecile would say the same thing for French.
I think we had a big problem with the language in Algeria because we were colonized, and we had a poet and writer, Malek Haddad. He wrote French language is my exile.
Is my exile.
I am in exile in French language, and it was a response to a French writer, Gabriel Audizio, who said, "Le français est ma patrie. French is my patrie, ma patrie." And
Homeland.
Malek Haddad stopped to writing and said, "Well, I can't continue to write." And in our independence war, the identity of Algeria was defined as Arabic. So you have to write in Arabic language if you want to be a real Algerian. But we were scholarized only in French because we had not. It's not the same thing in Morocco and Tunisia, because Morocco and Tunisia were not considered as département. They were not colonized, but protectorate. It was not the same politics. And we were considered as French. So in school, I only learned French because it was forbidden to speak in class in Arabic. And it was just the same thing for France in France itself, with Bretagne, with Occitanie, with La Corse, because the Jacobin system, the Republic of Jacobin, the French Revolution said France is one republic, and so one language, French, and not you have only to speak in French and to learn French. And we had another writer, our biggest writer, Katib Yassine. He said, French is our butin de guerre. Butin de guerre, how do you translate this? Our
war loot of the war.
Yeah.
War games.
Voilà, notre butin de guerre. But after that, when he entered, he wrote in French, and he said, no, in the end of the 60s, he said, no, I lost my mother language and I lost all. I have now to write in popular language, not in classical Arabic, not in French, but in popular language. And he made many theater in Arabic, popular Arabic. And we have the other poet and writer, Muhammad Dib. He said, yes, I stay with French, and I have to do with French, and to, comme il dit, je me suis fait un costume à ma mesure, un costume dans la langue française. Donc,
But Habib, you have to ask the question then, of the three examples you've given, which one does Debasish apply to English? Does he think that English is his exile? Does Debasish think it's his war loot? Or I think it's the third one, it's the Mohammed Dib, isn't it? Debasish, you would say that English is something that you want to use.
Definitely the third, Andy. Definitely the third.
And so for me and my generation, we had this problem. But it was only political problem, because after that, I said, well, writing, nobody writes in mother language. But we all of us, we write always in a foreign language, in another language. We have to traduce our mother language in our writing language. Writing is translating. Écrire,
and traducing. Surely that's what Cecile has shown. She's not admitted, but she's tried to defend her traducing of certain elements of what Debasish has written. So translating and traducing are a very maybe Mary has a comment on traducing and translating. Have you been translated into French, Mary?
No, I haven't. No, but I mean, obviously, I think it's fantastic. But I am very interested in that idea of the mother tongue, because I mean, we have English in Ireland as well, of course, and it is our mother tongue now, because actually, as you know, I'm sure our own language was obliterated or wiped out by during the colonial period. You know, so the Irish language. In fact, even in the time of my grandparents, at the beginning of the 20th century, Irish people were not allowed to speak Gaelic, you know, the Irish language. I mean, just as you have said in relation to Algeria. So, but what I think is interesting is that the English in all those former colonies is never the English of England. I mean, there's a whole phenomenon. Many books have been written about Hiberno English, which is the English of Ireland, and it's not the same language. You know, it's a different form of English, and I suspect that Anglo English is also another form of English. You know, it's and well, for my money, that implies a great richness. I mean, in that it's not a second. You know, I suppose. You know, if one were to adopt the more the more colonized craven posture of looking up to the language of the colonizer as the standard, you know, the English of the BBC, etc., as being the golden standard, one might feel that other versions of English were somehow less good, but actually I believe that the English of those formerly colonized places is extremely rich, because actually in Hiberno English you have the Gaelic language just underneath, because Hiberno English very often uses the syntax of the Irish language, you know, and I can hear that because I know both languages, but it's very strong, and it was very strong in the older generations. I could hear it in the English spoken by my grandparents and by my parents. Maybe less so now because of the influence of the media and young people being very open to, let's say, American English, etc. But so, and in
Cecile, just a moment. Cecile,
yes?
Our technical team is saying we have to end in 5 minutes. Our technical team is saying.
Yeah.
And maybe
another
poem. I'd love to hear.
It's got a message.
Yeah. We must let Debasish read his poems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll just read one last poem, and then Cecile and anyone else can make a comment. I'll just take a couple of minutes and read that last poem, which is "Cafe by Night." That poem. A deep sky at night comes down and wanders uneasy among half-empty cafes. It haunts the egg yolk of warmth and inviting chairs with the thrill of alienness. Many years ago, night had knocked at moonlight on a bit of pavement nearby that broke like glass, only soundless, and stayed on as jagged stars above a cafe front. Van Gogh hurt his fingers raising an ochre hand off the table to touch the edge of stars. The porch light is switched off. A half-light reigns. Van Gogh infused with water. Imagine the painter's rush before ruins rebuild memory, before we wake up on a block of marble from time's quarry in ruins studio. I had finished my glass of wine. The cafe was closing. Only Van Gogh and me. We were drifting across ourselves like the sun and moon in an empty room.
Café la nuit, un ciel profond descend la nuit et se met à errer, mal à l'aise, parmi les cafés à moitié vides. Il hante le jaune de la chaleur et les chaises qui invitent au frisson de l'étrangeté. Il y a de nombreuses années, la nuit avait frappé le clair de lune sur un bout de trottoir tout proche. Il s'était cassé comme du verre, juste sans bruit, resté en étoile déchiquetée au-dessus de la façade d'un café. Van Gogh s'est blessé les doigts en levant de la table une main ocre pour toucher le bord des étoiles. La lumière du porche est éteinte, la pénombre règne. Van Gogh, imprégné d'eau. Imaginez la hâte du poète avant que les ruines ne reconstruisent la mémoire, avant que nous nous éveillions sur un bloc de marbre venu de la carrière du temps dans l'atelier de la ruine. J'avais fini mon verre de vin, le café fermait, juste Van Gogh et moi, à la dérive en nous, comme le soleil et la lune dans une pièce vide.
Thank you, Cecile.
Thank you, Debasish.
I would just, before we end, like to mention a few names who have been very instrumental. I would like to personally thank them, not only behind the book, but also this evening's event. First and foremost, I would like to thank my publisher and great friend, Habib Tengor. Habib, you have been a wonderful friend. It's such a warm relationship that you have struck up. Thank you so much. I would like to thank my two editors and translators, Geetha Ganapathy Dorè and Cecile Oumhani. Thank you, Cecile, for being here and being the moderator. You've steered us wonderfully out of all the choppy waters, perhaps. Thank you so much. I would like to thank my friend at Leeds, Brendan Nichols, Nikki Hinchcott. I would like to thank Indranil Chakraborty, who has made the connection with Alliance Française possible in Calcutta. I would like to thank Leonardo Tonus, again, another great relationship I forged, who has supported with his Progetto Migra, this particular event. Thank you so much, Leonardo. I would like to thank Madame Kanchana Mukhopadhyay, President of Alliance Française, for coming on board and supporting this particular event, showing your great love of literature and the arts. I would like to thank Mr. Shomrat Bhaduri, also of Alliance Française, for being the bridge between me and Kanchana Madam and taking things forward. Thank you so much. And of course, I would like to thank Anitesh Chakraborty and Akash Gangopadhyay of Prohor, who are not seen, but they are the people behind the scenes who have managed this event to a perfect T, you might say. So thank you all. And Cecile will have the last word now.
Well, I would like to give Madame Kanchana the last word. She honored us by her presence tonight, and I thank you, the panelists, but I would like Madame Kanchana to close the session.
Merci, Cecile. Actually, it's a great honor for me because Debasish, I never knew him personally, But when he sent me his book, I found it is very worth it. And the discussion we had today is so engrossing. I am really thankful to all of you for your rich contributions, and for giving Alliance a chance to be one of the co-hosts of such a good program. And I wish we can have this sort of connections through other poets. As Habib said, it will be a real pleasure for us. We are always open to that. Anytime you feel like, we'll be in touch, and we'll try to build the bridges between different culture and language. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's go on building bridges, as you have just said, Madame Kanchana. Goodbye. And
Thank you, Habib,
very
Joe,
much.
Berry, Andy,
See you later.
Cecile, bye-bye. Stay well.
À
Stay well
bientôt.
too.
J'espère qu'on gardera le contact.
Oui.